All right, today we're going to talk about Ruth chapter 1. And last week we really dove a lot into the context of the book of Ruth. What was the setting? It was during the time of the judges, and it was also, they were in the land of Moab, whereas they were once in the land of Bethlehem. So today we're going to kind of dive into that a little deeper, and we're going to talk about what happens in the first chapter. And hopefully we can give a little more context rather than just reading it all out. We're going to try and give a little more of an understanding of this chapter. So we know that after they went to Moab, they married two Moabite women. The two sons of Naomi and her husband, they married two Moabite women, which they weren't necessarily supposed to do, right? So they married them, and they don't have any children, unfortunately. And the husband of Naomi dies, and then the two sons of Naomi die. So Naomi's pretty upset by this point, because she comes to Moab thinking that she was going to get away from all the famine, all the suffering that was going on in Israel, and then she ends up having more suffering than she had before. So she's upset, but she's also upset with God. And she's about to go back to Israel because she found out that the famine is done and she has land back in Israel. So she's going back to Israel, back to her people, because her husband and her sons are dead. And her two daughter-in-laws are like, yeah, we'll go with you, because they were both very loyal. And again, if you remember my video last time, it gives us a complete twist, a complete turnaround on what we would have thought. We would have thought that the Israelites would have been the one faithful and with noble character, but it seemed as though it was these Moabites who had the noble character. They were the ones who were loyal to their mother-in-law and were willing to follow them. And when Naomi says, no, don't follow me, they argue with her. They say, no, we want to. And Naomi, she's like, what am I supposed to do? Even if I was able to find another husband and I was able to have another child by some miracle, are you really going to wait long enough for that child to grow old enough for you to marry them so that they can take care of you? Like, it just doesn't make sense. There's nothing for you with me. Go home. And Orpah, one of the daughter-in-laws, she's just crying because she loves her mother-in-law. She's loyal to her, but then she does listen because she's obedient as well. And she listens and she goes home just like her mother-in-law said. But Ruth refuses. She clings to her and says, no, where you go, I'm going to go. Your God will become my God. And if you remember, I think it's in verse 13, it says, would you tarry for them till it was talking about if she was able to have children, if Naomi was able to have children and they were able to grow old enough for Ruth and this other sister-in-law to marry. She says, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Like, would you wait for them to get old enough to marry? Nay, my daughters, for it grieveth me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. So it seems as though Naomi is blaming God for what's going on. He says, it's because of God's hand. God's hand is away from me. God's not blessing me anymore. God's against me right now. And you guys are suffering as a result of it. So she says, just go away. Go home. Go back to your people where you can be taken care of. Maybe you can remarry or something like that. So she's just telling them, just go home to your families. But Ruth, of course, is refusing. And this God who Naomi was just blaming for all the problems, saying, God is against me. This is happening because God is against me. Now Ruth is saying, your God will become my God. It says, where you go, I'm going to go. So we see this huge difference between the Israelite who isn't trusting God, who isn't faithful to God, who's blaming God for everything, and this Moabite who was supposedly supposed to be pagan, was supposed to be following these other gods. She's being more faithful to the God of Israel and being more loyal to God's people than Naomi is. So she says, I want to go with you. And she's like, yeah, fine, you can come with me. And again, we shouldn't blame Orpah, which was the other daughter-in-law, for leaving, because that's what Naomi told her to do. She was just obeying. So again, that's another strong characteristic of this Moabite woman who was obeying her mother-in-law, even though she disagreed with her mother-in-law. She said, I want to go with you. And she said, no. So we shouldn't blame her for what she did. Ruth just was a little more stubborn. And of course, Ruth said, entreat me now not to leave thee, or return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die. There will I be buried, and the Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. So she's saying, I'm going to be with you till I die, right? When she said this, she was steadfastly minded, and okay, so she's going. And then it says in verse 19, it says, so the two went unto the time, and they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them and said, "Is this Naomi?" Because remember, Naomi was from Bethlehem. And she's returning home, and she has land there and stuff like that. And she said unto them, "Call me not Naomi," which, by the way, means pleasant in Hebrew. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Okay, that's a lot right there. So she's returning home. People are happy to see her, like, "Is this Naomi?" And she's like, "Why call me Naomi?" Which means pleasant. She's like, "Call me bitterness. Call me Mara, because God has afflicted me. God has punished me. I went out full, and God has brought me back empty. God has been against me." And we look at this and we're thinking, what? God wasn't against you. You left God. God said to stay in Israel. He told the people, "Don't leave Israel. This is where I'm going to bless you." The people of Israel likely being punished by God because of their sinfulness, because of their unfaithfulness, but then that doesn't justify them leaving Israel and going to another place where God said not to go. And now she's upset with God because God didn't bless her. She said, "Oh, I disobeyed God and I was full," right? Yeah, that's how I look at it. She's saying, "Oh, when I was disobeying God and I went to Moab, I was full of things. Like I had my husband, I had my children, I had my wealth, but now God has brought me back empty," right? Well, maybe because you disobeyed him, maybe because you weren't in the place where he said he was going to bless you. But the point was, we can see that Naomi is at a pretty bad spot in her life. She's saying, "Don't call me happy, don't call me pleasant, call me bitterness, because that's what I am." And anyways, it gives us a little more of a context in the next verse. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, which returned to the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem in the beginning of barley harvest. So we already get a little bit of a context for the rest of the story, because, of course, if you know the story of Ruth, Ruth goes off gleaning in the fields, and this is during the harvest season, so that gives us a little bit of a context there. So, again, we can see that the story seems to be revolving around Naomi, not necessarily Ruth. Naomi seems to be the one whose character needs to develop, not Ruth. Ruth seems like she's fine. She's the one following God. She's the one saying, "Your God will be my God," stuff like that. So let's continue this next week.
Hey everyone, if you liked the video, then feel free to click the like button. If you want to see more content like this.
All right, today we're going to continue our discussion over the book of Ruth, and we're primarily going to focus on Ruth chapter 2. But before we get into Ruth chapter 2, let's go ahead and jump back to Ruth chapter 1, verse 20, and just to give a little bit of context into what's going to happen in Ruth chapter 2. And so we know that in Ruth chapter 1, Naomi, she leaves her place of origin because of a famine. So there was something in the land of her origin where she just felt like she had to leave. So she left and she went to Moab, a place where they were kind of distant relatives to the Israelite people. And then we see that eventually bad things happen to her and she ends up leaving Moab and she comes back to Israel. But on her way back to Israel, where she's about to see all of these different relatives that she had left, while she's there, people start saying, "Is this Naomi? Is this the woman who left?" And she says in verse 20 of chapter 1, "And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara." So we see that she's changed her name. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." She's blaming God for everything. She's saying, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. She says, "Call me bitter, call me Mara." And she says, "Because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." And he says, "I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" I find it interesting that she calls the Lord Almighty. A synonymous term might be omnipotent, right? So all-powerful, or in her situation, almighty. So in other words, she's saying, God could have done anything. He could have blessed me in the land of Moab. He could have kept my husband alive. He could have kept my sons alive. But the Lord, who could have done anything, chose to deal bitterly with me. The Lord chose to bring me to this humble place. The Lord chose to take my sons from me, my husband from me. So she's just angry with God, and she's blaming God for everything. She's not blaming God. She's not blaming herself for the fact that she left the land of Israel. She's not blaming herself for all these different things. She's blaming God. And that's when we get introduced to the book, or the second chapter, chapter 2. We see in chapter 1, the last verse, it says, "And they got to Bethlehem during the time of the harvest." So now, in chapter 1, or chapter 2, verse 1, we get introduced to a new character named Boaz. Boaz is a kinsman. He's a relative of Elimelech, the former husband of Naomi. And that plays a key role into this story, right? That's a good introduction to what's about to happen. And it says he's a wealthy man. It says he's a mighty man. You know, he's got a lot of land. He's got a lot of harvesting going on. And there's actually, Ruth goes to his field and starts harvesting from his field. You might be thinking, that's a little weird, right? Different culture, different time, different law, right? Because this was ancient Israel. God had set up a specific law for how to take care of the widows and how to take care of the poor, how to take care of the strangers in the land. And Ruth qualified for each of those things, right? So God had actually said that the poor and the strangers in the land and the widows and stuff, they could actually go to the fields and they could glean from the fields. They could take from the fields on the corners, I think it was, and they can pick up the scraps, right? So that was one of the ways that God took care of the poor and the strangers in the land of Israel. So the non-Israeli people, they could go out and start harvesting from the corners of the fields or pick up the scraps, as well as the poor people could do the same. So Ruth asked permission from Naomi, and Naomi was like, yeah, we need food, right? So she goes, and Ruth goes, not Naomi. So Naomi, this is her land, right? I don't know if you've ever been to another country, but sometimes you feel a little out of place when you're in another country. I kind of understand how Ruth could feel a little awkward going to this place. She's a stranger. Everyone else around her is probably Israeli. And she's thinking, she kind of feels out of place. So Naomi could have done this and not felt so awkward, but it was Ruth who went out of her way to provide for the family. She could have gone back to Moab, the place where she felt most comfortable, the place where her family was, the place where she could have gotten another husband, where she could have been taken care of. But instead, she decides, I'm going to take the initiative. I'm going to help provide for Naomi. So we see that she's doing that. She's gleaning in the fields, and then Boaz shows up. And then Boaz talks to one of his servants and said, who is this woman that's here? And not that he was like upset that she was there. He was just curious because he'd never seen her before. And the servant says, this is Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi. She's come back with Naomi and stuff like that. And he starts giving him a little bit of details. But what's interesting to me is that when Boaz talks to Ruth, he gives her more information. He says, I've heard that you've done this and this and this. So he starts giving information that the servant didn't tell him, or at least the Bible in the book of Ruth doesn't record that he gave him that information. So what it could have been is that Boaz had heard rumors of this woman named Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi, and how she had done all these things. So then when Boaz comes to his field and he sees this strange woman in his field, he asks the servant, who is this? And he says, this is Ruth. So Boaz may have already heard these rumors about Ruth, and he was already kind of impressed with her, and now this is the first time he's actually gotten to know who she is. So he comes to her and he says, he starts blessing her, saying, you can stay in my field and you can harvest as much as you want and stuff like that. The men, they're going to protect you, they're going to keep you safe, and don't go to anyone else's field, just go to my field. So Ruth is feeling kind of special, right? And Boaz, he tells the men who are working in his field, they say, leave some extra scraps so that she can pick them up and stuff and bring them home to her mother-in-law. So he starts doing that. And then Ruth, she grabs all these scraps, and it's a huge amount compared to what you would usually get from picking up scraps. And she brings them home to her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law is like, what is this? How did you get so much? Whose field were you gleaning in? And this is also important information because some might assume that Naomi sent her specifically to this field to try to woo Boaz, the relative. But it seems as though Naomi didn't even know she was going to that specific field. So she's asking Ruth, whose field did you go to? And he says, I went to this man named Boaz, and he was very kind to me and stuff like that. And Naomi is like, oh my goodness, this is perfect. It's like, he is actually a relative of ours. And another law that you should probably be aware of is the kinsman redeemer law. And this was this concept, again, it was a different culture back then. We don't have the same laws. But there were several different reasons why they did it this way. It's why God formed it this way. One was probably to take care of the widows. So, for example, if someone got married and the husband died, well, then the brother of the husband would marry the widow, and then so forth. But it could also be, and that was the case for Judah and Tamar. Remember, Judah, his son died, Tamar's husband, and then he gave him his second son. So then after he died, he's like, well, I'll give you my third son, but not right now. Wait till he's older. So we can see that was kind of going on already. So anyway, so there was that redeemer thing. So Naomi is excited because she's thinking, this guy is a relative of my former husband, so he can redeem us, he can take care of us, he can marry Ruth and provide for us. So she was kind of excited because she's already seeing that Boaz is showing kindness to them. So she's excited about this, and she says, Ruth, you got to keep gleaning in his fields. Don't go to any other fields, just go to Boaz's fields. So Ruth, it says she was obedient to her mother-in-law. And again, we can look at chapter 1 and see that Ruth was very loyal to her mother-in-law. And then chapter 2, we see that Ruth is still very loyal to her mother-in-law. But we can see a huge shift between Naomi's behavior in chapter 1 and Naomi's behavior in chapter 2. In chapter 1, it ends with her being bitter, right? She's angry at God. But then in chapter 2, she's saying, blessed be this man, and let the Lord bless him. And then she's getting so hopeful and stuff. She's starting to get that hope back. So we can see a huge contrast between chapter 1 and chapter 2 when it comes to the development of Naomi. Not so much of a contrast between Ruth, because she was loyal in the beginning and she was loyal in the second chapter. So it's just interesting to see how Naomi is developing in this story. But we'll try and pick up in chapter 3 next week.
Hey everyone, if you liked the video, then feel free to click.
All right, today we're going to talk about Ruth chapter 3. And if you remember, the story seems to be revolving around Naomi's development, her character from bitterness to joy, but also her relationship with God. So you see from the very beginning of the book, chapter 1, verse 1, she's running away from God in a sense, right? She's leaving the place, the people of God, and she's going to a place who are known for persecuting the people of God, the Moabites, there was a history between them where the Moabites were very cruel to the Israelites at one point in their history. And then we also see that she's leaving the land of Israel, the place where God said he's going to bless his people. She leaves that place. So it seems as though she's kind of abandoned God and went her own way. She settles down in the land of Moab, and she seems like she's happy there, right? And then her husband dies and her 2 sons die, and she comes back bitter. Not just bitter at her circumstances, but bitter at God. She's blaming God for everything, saying God was the one who has allowed this affliction, saying this is the Almighty God, the God who can do anything. He's allowed this to happen to me. And she's blaming God for what happened to Ruth and Orpah, how they lost their husband. She's like, I'm grieved because the Lord has done this to me, and now you're affected by this. So she seems very upset with God. But then as the story progresses, we see that she starts going back to God, right? She goes back to the place of God. She goes back to the people of God. She goes back to being hopeful. She goes back to blessing people in the name of the Lord. So it seems as though her relationship with God is growing. So in chapter 2, she becomes a lot more hopeful because Boaz comes into the picture, and she's thinking, this is the man who has the ability to redeem us, has the ability to marry Ruth and to take care of us. It even says that he's a wealthy man, a mighty man. And to say mighty, it could mean that he's a warrior, or it could mean that he's a noble man. So, I mean, there's different translations for that particular word. But the point is, she's really excited because he seems to be showing favoritism towards Ruth, making her feel special, and he happens to be a kinsman of Elimelech, her former husband, so he has the right, he has the ability at least, to redeem Ruth. And so she's excited about this. So she tells Ruth, make sure you're always harvesting in his field, make sure you're staying around him, stuff like that. So Ruth is doing this. But by chapter 3, we start getting more of a glimpse into Naomi's matchmaking skills, right? So Naomi, every one of us probably knows someone who's a matchmaker, right? They see 2 people and like, we need to get them together. And Naomi seemed to be one of those people, right? She's thinking they're a perfect match. They're related in a sense, not like they're related by marriage. And they're related in a sense, and he can redeem her by the law, and he's wealthy, and she's so sweet, and he's so kind, and she's so virtuous, and all these different things. So she's thinking this is a perfect match. But Boaz seems to be clueless, right? So she's upset. It doesn't say she's upset, but she's kind of getting kind of excited about this, and Boaz isn't getting a clue. So she's like, Ruth, go get dressed up. Go take a bath, wash yourself off, get cleaned up, put on some ointments, get on some good clothes, because you're going to go see Boaz. And we have to remember this is in stark contrast to what Ruth normally looks like to Boaz. Because Ruth, whenever she's around Boaz, she's working in his fields. Well, what is she wearing when he's working in his fields? Probably some old garments. What does she look like? She's probably sweaty, dirty from all the stuff going around. And so he's not likely he likely has never seen her all dressed up before. So Naomi's like, get dressed up. We're gonna go get ourselves a man today. So she's telling Ruth, go ahead and get dressed up and go to him tonight. So there was something special about that night. There was going to be some threshing. So he was going to be sleeping outside that night. They were going to thresh the barley or whatever they were harvesting, which I believe it was barley. So they were going to thresh the barley, and the men were going to sleep outside, likely to protect the threshing floor, to protect what they've already threshed, what they've already harvested, from people stealing it. So she's like, he's going to be out there that night. So you go ahead, after he's already gone to bed, after he's already started to rest, you go to him, and she says, and uncover his feet. And we might be like, that's kind of weird. Why would she do that? And then Naomi goes on to say, and he'll know what that means. He'll know what to do. So we look at this and we're like, is this an inappropriate request, right? Is she asking Ruth to go do something inappropriate just to kind of get the attention of Boaz? Well, again, if we look at this and it says, go to him and do this thing and he'll know what to do, it seems as though it was a tradition that likely was associated with the kinsman redeemer law. The kinsman redeemer law that says someone who is a kinsman of the former husband can marry the widow because they want to raise up children, they want to take care of the widows and things like that. So this was likely a tradition that came along with that, because Naomi makes it clear he'll know what to do. He knows about this tradition. So Ruth is very obedient. Throughout the entire book, she's obedient. The only time she's not obedient is when Naomi tells her to leave and she refuses, right? And that doesn't say that she's a bad woman. That just says she's a very loyal woman. So Ruth decides she's going to do that. She waits till he's asleep or till he's resting, and she goes to him and she uncovers his feet. So let's go ahead and read, verse 6. And she went down into the floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law bade her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of corn. And she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid her down. And it came to pass at midnight that the man was afraid and turned himself, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. So there's a little bit of integrity when it comes to Boaz in this sense. You know, if someone was to wake up and find a woman at his feet while he's sleeping, and he's not startled or anything, it's probably not a very good man. But Boaz is startled because he's thinking, who is this person? I don't know you. So he's not in a comfortable position. He's kind of startled, and it says, and he said, who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman. So again, this looks a little inappropriate, right? She's saying, spread your skirt around me, for you're a kinsman, you're related to me. And we might look at that and be like, what's going on? Again, it's likely not something that's supposed to be inappropriate. It's likely her way of saying, spread your protection over me, cover me with your protection in marriage, because she's saying, you are a near kinsman. And again, Naomi told Ruth, Boaz will know what you mean, right? Boaz knows what this tradition is. He knows exactly what this means. So this was likely a way to propose, a traditional way to propose to someone who is a near kinsman if you want them to redeem you. So she's going through the tradition. She's doing what they were supposed to do. And again, to kind of verify that this was not something that was meant to be immoral, that she was not asking for something inappropriate, he says unto her, blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter. Not really my daughter, but the point is, he said, blessed are you of the Lord. So why would he say that if she was making an immoral request, right? So chances are she's not making an immoral request. She's just following the tradition of God. And it says, for thou hast shown more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich. So in other words, she's saying, you guys, you haven't been chasing, not you guys, Ruth, you haven't been chasing after all these young men. You haven't been trying to find all these different husbands. You be seeming to be following the law of God. You've been trying to find a kinsman redeemer. So he's saying, blessed are you of the Lord. So he's starting to see that Ruth is wanting to follow the law of God. She left her gods in Moab, and she came to Israel, and she decided she was going to follow the God of Israel and follow the law of Israel. So he's saying, blessed are you because of that. And it seems as though he wouldn't have said that if they were about to break the law of God and sleep together, right? So it says, and now, my daughter, fear not. I will do to thee all that thou requirest. What does he mean? He means, I'll marry you, right? Because Naomi told her, he'll know what this means. It's a tradition that probably had dealt with the kinsman redeemer, a way to propose to your kinsman to redeem you. So he said, I will do what you require. He says, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. So he says, I will marry you, not just because of duty, right? But because you are a good woman. You are a virtuous woman. And again, that's more evidence to suggest that this wasn't an inappropriate thing. She wasn't asking him for immoral things. She came to him specifically to do some traditional way of proposing to him. And he understood what she was trying to do, and he says, you're a virtuous woman. You're blessed of the Lord. things you wouldn't say to a woman who just asked you for something immoral. So nothing seemed to happen immoral in this situation. So if you ever hear that they did something wrong, probably not true. So he says that he is willing to marry her. He wants to marry her because she is a virtuous woman. But then he goes on to say that there's another person, another relative of Elimelech who's closer relation to you, in which case he would have the first right to marry you. So I'll go talk to him. If he wants to marry you, then great. Boaz is a nice guy. He's like, I'll step out of the picture. I just want you taken care of. It says, but if he doesn't, then I will marry you. So he says, just stay here overnight, because it was probably night. It was already dark. It said it was midnight. So he probably didn't want her traveling home alone where she could get hurt and stuff like that. So it was probably for her own protection. So he says, just stay here tonight. In the morning, you can leave and go back to your mother-in-law. And he gives her gifts, and she brings it back to her mother-in-law. And her mother-in-law is so excited. She's like, oh my goodness, he has agreed to marry you. And if not, then someone else is going to marry you because of the other kinsman, the other relative. But she's just so excited about this. And she even tells Ruth, she says, don't worry, he's not going to be able to sleep until he gets this matter settled. So we see the end of chapter 3, Naomi is super excited about what's going on. Ruth is still a loyal and noble woman, a very virtuous woman, and that's how the chapter 3 ends. And hopefully we can pick up in chapter 4 next week. All right, today we're going to talk about Ruth chapter 4. Now, this is the final chapter in the book of Ruth. However, I think I'm going to do another video just about kind of more of a conclusion, more of an application video. And I'll try and publish that on the same day. That way you guys don't have to wait another week in order to watch it. But this 4th chapter really wraps things up, and really you see a complete turnaround from chapter 1. So we saw from chapter 3, Ruth had already gone to Boaz, and she had done some things to where it was kind of like a kinsman redeemer proposal, to where she's kind of proposing to him, hey, will you redeem me? You are a kinsman of my former husband, and according to the law, I'm supposed to marry you so that you can redeem me and we can raise up children, stuff like that. So she had already done that, and Boaz had already told her, I am willing to do that. However, there's someone else who has the first right, someone who is closer kinsman to Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, the father-in-law of Ruth. He says, there's someone who's a closer relative to you who has the first right, and I'll ask him if he is willing to redeem you, then great. I'm glad you're taken care of. But if not, then I will redeem you because you are such a virtuous woman because of all these different things. And Ruth goes home, and her mother-in-law tells her, this is great. He's not going to rest until he gets this matter settled. And that was the end of chapter 3. And now we're into chapter 4, and it jumps right into it. And it's very, very possible that Boaz did exactly that he went straight to the other kinsman to ask him about this. So it says that then went Boaz up to the gate in verse 1 and sat him down there. And behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and he sat down. So now Boaz is going straight to this kinsman. He's going to the gate of the city, lots of witnesses. This is usually where different affairs were taken care of, and where they were different matters, legal matters, stuff like that was taken care of. So he calls his relative. He says, hey, come here, I have something to talk to you about. So he comes over, and then he sees 10 other people, elders who were going to be witnesses in this situation. He says, hey, can you guys come over too? So they come on over, and we're not quite sure why he chose 10. The Bible does talk about how you need more than one witness, right? It can't just be one person saying you did something, and that can be taken as law, right? So they're saying you do need multiple witnesses, and Boaz got 10 of them. And later on, this does become a common practice, I believe, in marriages where they had 10 different witnesses, but it was many centuries later where that became more common. But it seems as though Boaz is taking no shortcuts here. He goes to 10 different people and says, can you come here and listen to this matter? So they're all surrounding him. They're listening to the matter. And Boaz does something very interesting. Instead of saying to this kinsman, will you redeem Ruth the Moabitess? Because there may have been still some conflict between the Israelites and the Moabites because they had kind of a bad past, right? So he could have done that, and maybe the relative would have said, no, I don't want to redeem her. I don't want that reputation on my hands. I don't want to marry a Moabitess, something like that. But instead of that, he goes for a more tempting solution. And I find that very interesting. He wasn't trying to trick his relative into not marrying Ruth. It seems as though he was trying to almost go out of his way to get those two to marry, not because he wanted them to get married, but because he didn't want to say, I tricked you into not letting this happen. So he goes and he says, Naomi's come back, Elimelech's wife, and now she's trying to get someone to redeem her land, someone to purchase it. Will you redeem it? You are the closest kinsman, and I am the one after you. If you redeem it, great, but if not, then I'll redeem it. So this is pretty awesome for this guy, right? This near kinsman. He's thinking, oh, sweet, more land. So he's like, yeah, I'll do that. But then Boaz says to him, however, if you redeem the land, then you also have to redeem Ruth. So again, he didn't start with Ruth. He started with the land, which would have been a tempting proposition. But now he's talking about Ruth, who may not have been a very tempting proposition. So this guy, he says, ooh, actually, on second thought, I can't redeem the land. I can't redeem them because it will corrupt my inheritance. And he doesn't really go into an explanation on how it will corrupt his inheritance. It could have been that maybe he was saying, if I marry Ruth, then the children that she and I have, I'll have to give them an inheritance, and then the children that I have with my other wife, or whoever, if he was married or not, I have to give them inheritance, and it'll split my inheritance. So maybe he was just saying that it'll corrupt my inheritance, or maybe he was trying to act as though the land was bad, the land wasn't good, and that he wasn't actually saying no to Ruth, but that he was saying no to the land. But again, he had just said yes to the land, and now when Ruth is added to the package deal, he says no. So he says, you can redeem it. He tells Boaz, you can redeem them if you want. So there's a ritual, a type of tradition that they had to do. Something it's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, where the man is supposed to take off his shoe. The person who is refusing to redeem the wife or the land is supposed to take off his shoe and give it to the person who is going to redeem them. And from what I've researched, it was meant to be a sign to say that I give you the right to walk on this land, to redeem it. You now have the right to the land. You can walk on it. It's your land now. So they give him their shoe, the right to walk on it. So the near kinsman gives Boaz the shoe, and Boaz says to all the witnesses, you guys are all witnesses of this. I now am going to redeem Ruth and the land. So they say, we're all witnesses of that, and they start pronouncing blessings on them. And I find the blessings to be very interesting, and I feel like we just miss it so often. They said, they start blessing the relationship. They say, let Ruth be like Rachel and Leah. Of course, those were the wives of Jacob, the father of Israel, or of the tribes of Israel. And they also said, and let her be like Tamar. Now, these are three women that they mention, and each of them have some significance, right? Leah would have been the great-great-great-great-grandmother of Judah, or not the great-grandmother of Judah, but of the tribe of Judah, which would have been Boaz's great-great-grandmother. So she was the mother of Judah, so she was, of course, the ancestor of the descendants of the tribe of Judah, making her Boaz's ancestor. So it could have been saying, let her be like Leah, who was also very fertile, very good at having babies. But then they also say, and let her be like Rachel. Well, Rachel wasn't the ancestor of Boaz, so why mention Rachel? Well, Rachel, for the longest time, had trouble having kids. And it wasn't until God blessed her and gave her children that she was able to have kids, right? So she tried and tried and tried to have children, but it wasn't until God blessed her and gave her the children that she was able to have it. And these elders, these 10 witnesses, seem to be pronouncing the same thing on Ruth, who had already been married, had already tried to have kids, right? She's been married, but he's saying, now let God bless her like he blessed Rachel and let her have children. And the same thing for Tamar. Tamar married the son of Judah. And then, of course, they didn't have kids, and that son died. So then Judah gave her to the other son, and that son died, and they still didn't have kids. So now Judah and Tamar actually have kids. So it could have been, by mentioning Tamar, they were actually saying, let her be like Tamar, who didn't have children in her first marriage, but let her have children now. Let God bless her. So there's so much significance to the three people that they mentioned that we so often overlook it. So then we go on, and it says, in verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife. And when he had went in unto her, so after they had done the deed, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And we shouldn't miss this. It says the Lord gave her conception. So we see that the Lord's hand is at work in this whole story. Why didn't the Lord give her conception when she was married to the her first husband. It seems as though God had waited until this time to bless her with a child. And sometimes I'll hear people say that, oh, this child was an accident. He was unplanned. Well, no child was ever unplanned. God has always been planning children. His hand has always been at work. And if he blesses you with a child, it's because he wants you to have that child. So in this particular situation, that was definitely the case. It says God gave her conception. So she does get pregnant. Good morning, everyone. Well, today must have been very confusing. You go to the adult Sunday school room and the room's backwards, and you show up to the sermon and the pastor's 30 years younger. Must have been a very confusing morning for everyone. All right, today we're going to be talking about missions a little bit. As we just had our missionary conference, it felt reasonable to conclude it with a sermon over missions. And as I'm going through my PhD, one of the books that I'm going through right now is the book of Jonah and learning the Hebrew. And there's just, every time I go through a course, I just want to take it all in and then regurgitate it on you guys, right? Picture it like a mother bird. No, I'm kidding. And I'm not done with the course yet, so I didn't want to go too in-depth on the book of Jonah when I'm still learning things, and I really want to preach a sermon specifically over it. But today we're going to kind of talk about it a little bit because Jonah is just such a terrible missionary, and I just thought it would be a great sermon to talk about a terrible missionary during missionary conference. Today's title is, it basically means the servant of the Lord or the servant of God. It's Ebed Yehovah or Yahweh. Today, we're going to talk about how every Christian can understand what the right heart for missions is by understanding these two stories. And we're going to kind of compare and contrast the ministry of Jonah, the prophet, to the ministry of William Carey. Now, William Carey isn't a biblical character, but this was someone who felt God's call to missions, and he had just such a different perspective on it than Jonah had. So again, we're not going to go super in-depth on the book of Jonah, but everyone knows the story of Jonah and the whale. Well, it's not actually a whale as far as we know. It was just some very big fish that was able to swallow Jonah. An interesting fact, and we'll talk about this when I get to my sermon. Did you know the whale was transgender? Who knew that? Right. And we'll talk about it a little bit more. Obviously, it wasn't actually transgender, but the Bible in the Hebrew, it has gender for its words, and when it refers to the fish, the first time it refers to it as a masculine eating Jonah, and being in the belly of the fish, it's masculine form, and then later on it refers to the fish, but then it has the feminine gender, and there's significance to that, but I just thought it was funny. I was teaching the youth about it, and I drew on the board a big giant whale, and with the contemplating saying, what gender am I? Because the whole idea of the fish changing gender and stuff is just interesting, but it has significance in the book of Jonah. All right, so the story of Jonah. We know in 2 Kings, and you guys can turn to Jonah chapter 1 if you want, but we're just going to kind of start in 2 Kings chapter 14, verse 25. We know in this passage it talks about a man named Jonah, the son of Amittai. So when we read Jonah chapter 1, we know that Jonah, the son of Amittai, is likely the same person that it's referencing here. So then we can get a little bit of a glimpse to who Jonah was based on 2 Kings chapter 14. We know that he was considered to be the servant of God, and he was said to be the prophet or a prophet, right? So even though in the book of Jonah he's never referred to as a prophet, we know he was a prophet. We know that he has brought God's message, and he specifically brought it to the children of Israel. It talks about how he restored the borders of Israel from Lebo Hamath as far as the sea of Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was from Gath-Hepher. So basically, if you know the story of Israel, Israel kind of went through a split, and it became two different nations. You had the nation of Judah, and you had the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel was always terrible, just constantly, always had bad kings, and they were constantly going against God. And this was no exception during this time. But Jonah was a prophet to this wicked, wicked Israel. And what did Jonah prophesy to them based on what God had given him, the information? He prophesied mercy to this wicked Israel. So when you get to the story of Jonah chapter 1, you would think a very similar message would happen. And Jonah, as he's called by God to go to Nineveh, right? It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." That Jonah being the prophet of God, Jonah being a servant, right? He's referred to as the servant of God. You would think this person is going to do exactly what God says to do, but the book of Jonah is very ironic. It's filled with irony, and he does the exact opposite. It says, "But Jonah rose up to flee unto Tarshish," which was super far away from the presence of the Lord, right? He's trying to go so far away that nobody even knows the name of the Lord anymore. So he's thinking, God's not going to use me somewhere where no one even knows who he is. So he's trying to flee as far away as he can, all the way to Tarshish. And he went down to Joppa, and he found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare thereof, and went down into it to go with them unto Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Now, in English, the concept of just paying the fare sounds like, just buying a ticket on a boat. But as far as we know, he was the only person, the only passenger. And in the Hebrew, the way that it's referred, it's almost as though he paid for the entire ship. Not that he bought the ship, but basically he paid for the ship specifically to go to Tarshish. And the fact that they had cargo probably meant that the ship sailors were trying to kill two birds with one stone. But Jonah convinced them, take me all the way to Tarshish. So he had to probably pay an amazing amount of price to flee the Lord's calling. Then said the sailor's response, of course, when Jonah actually when he's in the ship and they're sailing all the way to Tarshish, they're trying to flee from the presence of the Lord. The sailors don't know why Jonah's doing this. They don't know Jonah's fleeing from the Lord. And God sends this storm to them, and the ship is about to break, and they're all freaking out, right? They're throwing their cargo overboard. They're trying to lighten the ship, and they're crying out to their gods because they're polytheistic, right? They don't know the Lord. At least they don't know him as one of their own gods. So they're crying out to God, their gods, and they wake up Jonah. They say, you cry out to your God. Maybe he can save us, because none of our gods are doing it. And eventually they figure out that Jonah is the reason for all this, that the Lord is upset with Jonah. So they ask him, they said, what did you do? And he says, I'm a Hebrew. I serve the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, and the controller of the sea. Right? So they start freaking out, and they say, then said they unto him, what shall we do unto thee that the sea may be calm unto us? For the sea wrought and was tempestuous. So they understand Jonah is the reason for this calamity, right? Jonah is the reason why this storm is here. He's done something to upset his Lord, and he actually tells them what he did. But then they say, what are we supposed to do to fix this problem? Now, Jonah admits later on in Jonah chapter 4 that he knows God's a merciful God. He knows that if people repent, that God will turn his wrath for them. So Jonah likely would have understood at this point that if they had just turned the ship around and started going towards Nineveh, that God would have stopped the storm, because that's why the storm was there. The storm was there because Jonah was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, and he had told them at some point. But instead of saying that, this is what we need to do, just turn the ship around, I have to go do what God told me to do, and I need to repent, right? I need to turn from what I said I was going to do. And he said unto them instead, take me up and cast me forth into the sea. So shall the sea be calm unto you. For I know that for my sake this great tempest is upon you. And Jonah is probably correct. This probably would solve the problem. God's wrath being poured out right now is not on the sailors, right? The sailors done goofed many times, right? They were polytheistic. They didn't even know who the Lord was, or at least not a great understanding of him. But this was Jonah, the prophet of the Lord, the servant of God. He knew better, and yet he's fleeing from God. And God brought this great storm on them because of Jonah. So Jonah's thinking, if I'm dead, God's just going to stop the storm. So Jonah had two options here, right? Turn back and do what God said to do, or die. And for some reason, he was so against doing what God told him to do, he said, I'd rather die. Right? Just throw me overboard. And then the storm will pass. The storm will stop. Do we think Jonah was expecting a fish to swallow him? Probably not. Jonah understood that by throwing him overboard, he was going to die, but he would rather die than go do what God had commissioned him to do. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And then in this time, right, Jonah, in Jonah chapter 2, he talks about this experience, how he's been descending down to the bottom of the sea, right, to the bottom of the mountains, and he talks about this drowning experience. And then next thing he knows, right, he's being swallowed by a fish, and probably after several days, he realizes this fish isn't actually chewing on him. And he sees this as not God's destruction of him or God's judgment, but rather God's deliverance of him. And he starts praising God for his deliverance, saying, I went down to the bottom of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption. Another word for here is pit, from the pit or from the grave. O Lord my God. And later on he talks about, he says, salvation is of the Lord. So Jonah, who has preached God's mercy to wicked Israel, even though at that point Israel had not repented, but God was simply being merciful to them. Jonah, who had gone against God and was thrown into the sea, and yet God still delivered, still showed mercy to him. Jonah is starting to realize God's a pretty cool God who shows mercy to those who don't even deserve it. And after that, it's not 1:17. This would have been 3:17. Not even 3:17. I just got the verse wrong. And the word of the Lord came unto Jonah a second time, right? The fish has already spit him out, and the word of the Lord comes to him a second time, saying, arise, go into Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching that I bid thee. So Jonah arose. So this time he's actually going to do what God told him to do, and went into Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city of 3 days' journey. This passage right here, I was actually talking to the youth group about this today. In Hebrew, the name of God is actually found in this passage. And the name of God, or Elohim, can be translated in different ways. But translators have kind of struggled to know how best to translate this. It could be saying exactly what this is saying, that it was an exceedingly great city, or it could be saying that it was a great city to God. And I don't think it's saying that size comparison to God was great, but rather probably it was important to God. And we don't know why it would be important to God, this pagan nation, this pagan city, but something about it, God said, I want Jonah to go preach to that nation. So there was something important about it. And when it says a 3 days journey, it could also mean a 3 days visit. So it could be saying that this city was so important to God that it required Jonah to spend 3 days preaching in it in order for the message to properly get across. That's one way to interpret it. There may be other ways of interpreting it, such as it was just a really big city that took 3 days to walk through. And Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey, right? 1 day's journey. And he cried and said, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. We don't have any record of him preaching for 3 days. All we know is he preached for 1 day. And it seems like he was doing the very bare minimum. The city was so great or so big in size or maybe just so important to God that it required a 3-day visit. Jonah spent 1 day, as far as we know, preached a few words. In 40 days, Nineveh will be overthrown, and then that's all we get from him. But fortunately for Nineveh, this caught on real quick. And he caused it to be as soon as Jonah had preached this message, the word spread throughout all of Nineveh, and the people immediately started taking this very seriously. And we don't know the background of what was going on. Historians have figured out some things that may have been going on where they were constantly at conflict, and when God said, you're going to be overthrown, they took it very seriously because of the context that was going on in their life. And they started fasting, just the people on an individual basis, all of them just started fasting and putting on sackcloth, this idea of putting on this humiliating and uncomfortable garments to show this God that had just proclaimed judgment on them, to show him we really are repentant. We are serious about our heart of change. And then when the king heard about it, it says, and he caused it to be proclaimed and published through Nineveh to be decreed of the king and his nobles, saying, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Let them not feed nor drink water. Right? not eating, we can last for a while without eating food, but we can't last very long without drinking water. But the Ninevites, they were taking this very seriously, and they decided, we're going to show God just how serious we are about this repentance. We're not even going to drink water, and we're going to hope and pray. And it says, it was decreed that they should wear sackcloth, right, this uncomfortable garment, and cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn everyone from his evil way and from the violence that is in their hands. Who can tell if God will turn and repent and turn away from his fierce anger that we perish not? So the Ninevites are doing all this thing. They're starving themselves. They're not drinking. They're putting on this sackcloth, none of which Jonah told them to do. They are doing this completely of their own free will just to show God, please spare us. And they don't even know if God's going to do that because their gods were unreliable, right? Because they didn't have real gods. But they didn't know the Lord like Jonah knew the Lord. They didn't know the consistency of God, the truthfulness of God. And so when they do things to their gods, for example, right, their false gods, coincidence might happen. It may work, may not. But for the Lord, they don't know if it'll work because they don't know him the way Jonah knows them. And they're praying, they're doing all this just in the chance that God will save them. And God saw their works, that they had turned from their evil way. And God repented of the evil that he had said he would do unto them, and he did it not. The concept of repenting of the evil sounds kind of weird. In other translations, it doesn't say it that way. But in Old English, it would have made more sense. When we think of repentance, we think of we have to confess us doing something wrong, whereas that's not the case for God, right? Another way of saying this is just he turned away from the disaster that he had planned to do to them. So the Ninevites, they didn't know if God was going to do this. And it doesn't say that God turned his wrath away from them because they wore sackcloth. It doesn't say he turned his wrath away from them because they wouldn't drink water anymore, right? Those things were outward expressions of their inward heart motive. He saw what was in their heart. He saw that they were genuine, and they showed that genuineness through their actions, and God turned away his wrath from them. And now this is kind of the heart of Jonah, unfortunately. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly. And he was very angry. And he prayed unto the Lord and said, I pray thee, O Lord, was not this my saying when I was yet in my country? Therefore I fled before unto Tarshish, for I knew that thou art a gracious God, and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil. Therefore now, O Lord, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Now Jonah's rant seems kind of strange. Jonah is complaining that God is so merciful. Jonah is complaining that he's so slow to anger. Jonah is complaining that God sometimes shows mercy to people. Now, this is obviously ironic and a double standard because Jonah had been shown mercy from God. Jonah's entire nation had been shown mercy from God. Israel was perhaps maybe even more wicked. In fact, I would say it was more wicked than Nineveh in the sense that Israel knew better, but they still rejected God. And yet Jonah has the audacity to get angry at God because God is showing mercy to this foreign nation and saying, how could you? Jonah says, again, I beseech thee, take, I beseech thee, my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. We're taken back almost to Jonah chapter 1, where he tells the sailors, just throw me overboard. He would rather die than see Nineveh have the mercy of God. And this is a huge thing. And Jonah apparently thought that he had convinced God because he goes out and waits for God to destroy the city. And God, of course, doesn't destroy the city. But we see this huge double standard from Jonah. He was personally called to bring God's message to Nineveh, but he refused and sought to flee a great distance. He paid a lot for transportation to flee. He preferred death over proclaiming God's message to the heathens. He was shown an extraordinary amount of grace and mercy, but he was angry that God showed mercy to the heathens. Not a great missionary, right? And we question, why would God even choose Jonah? And I'm sure that there's lessons that we can learn from the story of Jonah, maybe from his bad example, but also just the idea that sometimes we're like Jonah, aren't we? We feel like it's okay for God to show mercy to us, but there are some who are less deserving of mercy, right? No one is deserving of mercy. That's kind of the definition of mercy. Mercy is when God doesn't do to you what you deserve. grace is when God does to you what you don't deserve, right? They're very similar, but kind of distinct. But none of us deserve mercy, and sometimes we feel like Jonah, where we're like, we deserve it more when none of us deserve it at all. So now we're going to talk about William Carey, a huge contrast between Jonah and William Carey. William Carey was someone who lived in England. I think it was in the 18th century, about 1790. He wrote this article talking about the need for missionaries. And there really wasn't many missionaries at that time. I mean, there were some, but they very far and few between. And he was a Baptist pastor, which wasn't a very popular denomination at that time, at least not in England. He was a teacher and also a shoe salesman. But he eventually became a missionary to India. But he's recognized as the father of Protestant missions because of his heart for missions, because he kind of was kind of made the way for other missionaries. And some of the things he talks about is very ingenious. Now, the question becomes, we know Jonah was called specifically by God to go to Nineveh, but did God come to William Carey and say, William, I want you to go to India? Well, William does feel as though God wanted him to go to India, but what caused him to want to do that? Or what caused him to think that's what God wanted? He said, our Lord Jesus Christ, a little before his departure, commissioned his apostles to go and teach all nations. I shall inquire whether the commission given by our Lord to his disciples be not still binding on us. So he writes this entire article talking about how the Great Commission still applies today, and not just applies to the apostles, right? The apostles are dead, but applies to each and every individual Christian. He said, some think little about it, right? This is how society was treating the Great Commission, or the fact that there are people going to hell. He said, some think little about it. Others are unacquainted with this state of the world, and others love their wealth better than the souls of their fellow creatures. It seems as if many thought the commission was sufficiently put into execution by what the apostles and the others have done, and that if God intends the salvation of the heathens, he will some way or other bring them to the gospel, or the gospel to them. All right, so society looked at the Great Commission, and for those who don't know what the Great Commission is, it's when Jesus, before he ascended into heaven, he told his disciples, I want you to go tell all the nations about me. I want you to tell them about the mercy that can be shown to them if they accept salvation, right? We call it the gospel. The word gospel in Greek, it basically just means good news. It says, go tell them the good news about salvation, because according to the Bible, we have to actually put faith in Jesus to accept salvation. So Jesus wanted the world to know about him so that they could accept that salvation. And some people apparently thought that the apostles, that only applied to the apostles, to Jesus' disciples, saying, they were supposed to preach to the nations, but that's done now, right? This has been sufficiently taken care of. We don't have to worry about going to places like Africa or India or South America, because the Great Commission has already been fulfilled. And William, of course, is going to argue against that. He says, it has been objected that there are multitudes in our own nation and within our immediate spheres of actions who are as ignorant as the South Sea savages, and that therefore we have enough work at home without going into other countries. Right, so one of the objections that they had was, why would we go to another country to preach the gospel when there are people even in our own nation who still don't know the gospel or haven't responded to the gospel? See, it's very Jonah-like mentality, right? Because Jonah was perfectly fine preaching to Israel mercy, but he didn't want to preach to Nineveh. Nineveh, that was one of the big cities of Assyria. Assyria were their enemies. They would torture the Israelites. And Jonah didn't want to have anything to do with those savages, those heathens. In fact, many times throughout the book of Jonah, you kind of see him comparing himself to the non-Israelite people, acting as though he is more righteous than them because he is Israelite or something like that. But a lot of times we have the same mentality. Let's just take care of our own country. Let's just take care of our own community. And certainly we should take care of our own community. And William is not against that. In fact, he says that there are thousands in our own land as far from God as possible, I readily grant. And that this ought to excite us to tenfold diligence to our work. And in an attempt to spread divine knowledge amongst them is a certain fact. But that it ought to supersede all attempts to spread the gospel in foreign parts,
seems to want proof, right? So William is saying, yeah, there are people in our own country who have not responded to the gospel yet. And that should motivate us to try so much harder to reach them. But that does not tell us that we shouldn't go to other countries and preach the gospel. In fact, he goes on to talk about why. He says our own countrymen have the means of grace and may attend on the word preached if they choose it. They have the means of knowing the truth, and faithful ministers are placed in almost every part of the land, whose spheres of actions might be much extended if their congregations were but more hardy and active in the cause. But with them, the case is widely different. They have no Bible, no written language, no ministers. So William is talking about here this idea that, yes, there are people in our country who need the gospel still, but they can easily find the gospel. There are churches on every corner over here, but yet there's places across the world that have never heard the gospel. There's no churches there. There's no ministers. There's no Bibles. They have no written language that can understand the Bible, even if they had a Bible. He says, so this was his idea of saying, yes, there's a need in our own country, but there's so much more need in other countries. So now he's going to start talking about the different objections that people give for not wanting to be missionaries, right? He says, first, as for the distance from us, right? People were saying, India is too far away, right? It's not safe to travel that far. His response is interesting. He says, whatever objections might have been made on that account before the invention of the mariner's compass, nothing can be alleged for it with any color of plausibility in the present age. So William is saying, that may have been a pretty good excuse 200 years ago before travel was safe, but now that we have, and he just talked about the mariner's compass, right? They had like steamboats at this time. We have jets. It probably took him weeks or maybe even months to get to India, but I could get on a plane today and probably get there probably by tomorrow, depending on the flight that I took. I mean, we have no excuse to this day. And even back then, when they just had like steamboats, he was saying we have no excuse because travel is so much easier for us just with the steamboats. Secondly, as to their uncivilized and barbarous way of living. So some people are saying, we can't go down over there. Those are barbarians. They're not civilized. They don't have toilet paper. Just kidding. I mean, maybe they didn't. I don't know. But, I mean, certainly that is a difficult thing. I've been in countries where they don't have toilet paper. It's uncomfortable. But his point was, this can be no objection to any except those who love of ease renders them unwilling to expose themselves to inconveniences for the good of others. It was no objection to the apostles who went among the barbarous Germans and Gauls and still more barbarous, the Britons, right? William Carey was Briton. And he's talking to Britons. He's talking to people in England. And he's saying, your excuse is that they're uncivilized? Do you know what we were like when the gospel reached us? We were not the most civilized nation in the world. But yet that was not an excuse to those who brought the gospel to us, to those who went out of their way to no longer be in ease, to no longer be in the comfort of civilization. They came to us with the gospel, and yet we use the excuse that it's inconvenient for us, that they're not civilized. How can we, who have been shown such grace and mercy, not show the same mercy to them when we were just like them at one point? He said, thirdly, in respect to the danger of being killed by them, it is true that whoever does go must put his life in his hand and not consult with the flesh and blood. But do not the goodness of the cause, the duties incumbent on us as the creatures of God and Christians and the perishing state of our fellow men loudly call upon us to venture all. Paul and Barnabas, who hazarded their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, they were not blamed as rash, but commended for doing so. So William is saying, yes, there is the possibility that you will die if you go to some of these countries and try to preach the gospel to them, right? The countries of the world, not all of them are Christian, and even some of the Christians aren't very nice, right? Some missionaries risk their lives to bring the gospel to these nations that are hostile towards the Christian faith. And William's saying, it's true, you could die. But isn't it worth it? Right? Isn't it a just cause to bring the gospel to these people, the perishing state of our fellow men, the fact that people are dying and going to hell, isn't it worth dying to bring them the gospel, knowing that it could save their souls? And he talks about how Paul and Barnabas, they weren't considered silly for bringing the gospel. They were commended for it. He says, in respect to contributions, so he's talking about finances. And at this church, we give what's called faith promise, this idea that we want people to figure out, what do you feel as though God would have you contribute to spreading the gospel around the world? Now, certainly, again, William Carey made it very clear, we have quite the mission field even in our backyard. But that doesn't supersede the fact that there are still people outside of this country who still need the gospel. So William Carey, he kind of wanted to address this idea. What about finances? And he said, in respect to contributions for defraying the expenses, money will doubtless be wanting, right? He says missionaries are doubtlessly going to be in need of money because they're going to be going to countries that are not their own. It's going to be hard for them to get jobs. And that's one of the reasons why we have to support missionaries in this church, is because many of the countries that they go to, they can't get work there. They have no way of making money. So they go there completely trusting that God is going to provide for them. And one of the ways that God does provide for them is through churches like this, who will willingly send money to help them. He says, if congregations were to open subscriptions of 1 penny, and I know what a penny is, but I don't know what 1 penny was back then. He says, of 1 penny or more per week, according to their circumstances, and deposit as a fund for the propagation of the gospel, much might be raised in this way. So it's very similar to how we do it, just this idea that the individual churches, they raise funds and send them to the missionaries. And he had other ideas. He taught about this idea that maybe there should be multiple missionaries going to the same field, they can work together, and there should be a third family to come, and they can work and provide for them, stuff like that. So it was an interesting concept, but he was trying to figure out how to write this article in a way that could say it's possible, right? God can do it if his people are faithful. In fact, even if his people aren't faithful, God is still faithful. We are exhorted to lay up treasures in heaven, he said. It is also declared that whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. These scriptures teach us that the enjoyment of the life to come bear a near relation to that which now is, a relation similar to that of the harvest and the seed. Now, when I had to just type it all in. I didn't have an ebook for this. And that was a mouthful, just trying to think of what he was trying to say there. But basically, what he's trying to communicate here is this idea that the Bible seems to teach us that us laying up treasures in heaven is like planting a small seed, and something that may seem insignificant to us here, but when we get to heaven, it's a harvest, right? And most people in here, everyone in here, as far as I know, understands how a seed works. The seed doesn't normally get smaller when you plant it. It gets bigger, right? It bears more fruit than it could as one individual seed. We talked about Thanksgiving earlier, this idea that they would eat 5 kernels of corn and stuff like that. And just this idea, sometimes we live off of those 5 kernels of corn, right? Instead of planting the corn or anything like that, we're just like, we just need to get by. But God says, no, plant some of it, right? Get by still, but plant some of it. And the riches in heaven from that are much more significant than the little seed that we're planting. So as we do things, maybe we share the gospel with someone, right? We plant that little seed, but then in heaven it's a harvest. Maybe when we give to the poor, we plant just a little seed, maybe something insignificant to us, or maybe it is big to us, but it's insignificant in comparison to what it lays in store for us in heaven. And I'm not trying to preach to you guys, do the right thing so that you can be rewarded. I think that's the wrong motivation. But I want to just tell you that when you're thinking of this life and you're thinking, does this life even make sense? This life seems worthless or something like that. The little things that you do in this life make a big impact in the life to come. So he was talking about how that we should be making sure that we're focusing on heavenly things rather than on earthly things. All right, so now let's compare and contrast them. Jonah was personally called to bring God's message to Nineveh, right? God came to him, he spoke to him, and said, this is what I want you to do. William was not personally called. But took the Great Commission as enough of a calling to risk it all for the gospel of Christ. Jonah refused and sought to flee a great distance. Carey accepted regardless of the criticism that he received from society, right? Instead of Jonah going to Nineveh, he went in the opposite direction. He went a great distance to flee from Nineveh, but yet William Carey went a great distance to follow God's commission. We can see that Jonah paid a lot for transportation to flee, right? He commissioned the entire ship and said, hey, you're a ship, can you take me to Tarshish? He had to pay the entire fare to take him to Tarshish. It was a great price to pay just to get out of doing what God had called him to do. But Carey, on the other hand, paid a great price to follow what God wanted him to do. Jonah preferred death over proclaiming God's message to the heathens. William Carey would rather die following the commission than live. Jonah was shown an extraordinary amount of grace and mercy, but yet he was angry when God showed mercy to the heathens in his eyes. But William Carey, he let the mercy that was shown to him and to his nation, the Britons, and he took that and it inspired him to start sharing the gospel, to start sharing that mercy with other people. So we can see a huge contrast in the missionary heart of Jonah and the missionary heart of William Carey. And my question is, what about us? What kind of heart do we have? Are we like Jonah, where we're kind of nationalistic in the sense that we think our country is so great that the other countries can burn in hell or something like that? And I don't think so. I don't think there's anyone in this room who thinks that way. But sometimes we act that way, right? We may not think that way, but sometimes our actions speak louder than our words or louder than our thoughts when we neglect to help those out in other countries who may have never heard the gospel. William Carey, in that article, he lists kind of the state of the world and talking about the different places in the world that have never heard the gospel. And certainly there are more now that have heard the gospel than there were then, but there are still so many people groups out there who have not once heard the gospel of Christ. They are so surrounded by perhaps these religions that are so hostile to Christianity that the people on the outside of those nations, they may have heard about Jesus, but they push back on it. And then missionaries or Christians, we don't want to go there because our lives may be at stake. Or we don't want to go there because it may be inconvenient or it's too far from us. But there are people within the center of that who have never even heard the gospel. And the question today is, what are we going to do about it? Now, God may call you individually to be a missionary. Now, certainly we're all missionaries in the sense that we're all called to fulfill the Great Commission. And that may be within your family. That may be within, it is within your family, right? If you have people within your family who have never heard the gospel, it's up to you to share the gospel with them. There may be people among your friend group who have never heard the gospel. It's up to us to share the gospel with them through our friends, through our city, through our state, through our nation, and through the world. The best way to spread the gospel is not through online services, though it's a great benefit to us. The best way to share the gospel is through lives, right? From one life to another, spreading the gospel. Scott, he had shared his testimony earlier, and it's a powerful message, right? Just this idea of a story. And certainly you will probably remember his message more than you will remember mine. But that's the beauty of a life changed. It stands out to us. All right, let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, thank you for this day. Thank you that we're able to dive deeper into your word, Lord, and to just talk about the book of Jonah, Lord. You included it in your word for a reason. And though certainly not everything in the Bible is something that we're necessarily going to be good examples, right? There's terrible people in the Bible, and Jonah may be among them, Lord. But would we have done the same in his situation if Nineveh was our enemy the way that Nineveh was the enemy of Israel, where they would torture them and butcher them as their enemies? Would we really want you to show mercy to them? Lord, if there's anyone in here who has a heart like that, who says, mercy is fine for me, but not for thee, right? This idea that we're kind of selfish with your gospel. We don't want it to be preached to others because we don't think they deserve it. Lord, I pray that if there's anyone like that today, that you would change their heart, change our hearts, Lord, to be more like yours. Lord, none of us are deserving of your mercy. None of us are deserving of the grace that you've shown to us, but yet you showed it to us because you loved us. And not just us, but the whole world. May we do what you've called us to do and preach the gospel to the world, whether that's us individually being missionaries or maybe just supporting missionaries throughout the world. Lord, may we be teachers of your gospel to our families, to our friends, to the strangers that we meet, Lord. May we continue to preach your word no matter what. Lord, please guide us, protect us, and direct us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.